So when you think about colonial America, you probably think about the revolution, right? But before all of that, what did it sound like? What did it look like? Today, we're going to dig into how a totally unique American culture was born when old world traditions slammed right into new world realities.
Seriously, let's just pause on that for a second. We talk so much about the politics, but what did people actually see when they walked around? What music did they hear? What were they reading? Let's try to get a feel for what their world was actually like.
You know, the colonists didn't just copy and paste their culture from Europe and drop it in America. It just wouldn't work. It had to change. Their art, their music, their writing, all of it got reshaped by this brand new environment, new challenges, and of course, new neighbors. And it's right there, in that collision, that you start to see a truly American identity taking shape.
All right, first up, let's talk about what colonial Americans actually saw around them, their art. And it was this fascinating mix, really, all about expressing both deep religious faith and, well, showing off their good fortune.
See, art back then wasn't just for decoration. It was a tool. It had a job to do, whether that job was showing off how wealthy and important you were or expressing these really profound religious beliefs in a super direct way.
For the wealthy merchant class, getting your portrait painted was a total power move. They'd hire famous artists like John Singleton Copley to paint them, but not just as they were, but as they wanted to be seen. Every little detail, the fancy clothes, the imported furniture, was like a status symbol. It was basically a giant painting that screamed, "I've made it."
But faith painted a very different picture depending on where you were. If you were in Puritan New England, the churches were super plain, no frills, because they thought anything else was just a distraction from God. But head south to Catholic Maryland, totally different story. You'd find churches filled with all the rich, ornate imagery and ritual you'd expect from European Catholic traditions.
And look, art wasn't just for the rich or for the church. Not at all. Everyday colonists were pouring their creativity into the things they used every single day. You know, a hand-stitched quilt, a beautifully carved wooden chest, some painted furniture. These things were built to be used for sure, but they were also beautiful pieces of folk art that just brought a bit of humanity and design into the home.
Okay, so we've covered the visuals. Now, what about the sounds of the colonies? From these really solemn hymns you'd hear in a church to the super lively tunes of a fiddle in a tavern, music was absolutely central to colonial life.
Just like with art, colonial music kinda had two different vibes. On one hand, you had sacred music. Think communal psalm singing in those Puritan churches. It was simple, focused on everyone sharing their faith together. And then you had the other side of it, the fun stuff, the energetic folk songs and dances that would just fill up homes and taverns purely for a good time.
Okay, I want you to look at this date, 1640. This year marks a huge, huge milestone in American cultural history. So what happened? What made it so important?
This was the year the Bayes Psalm book was published. Now, why does that matter? Because it was the very first book printed in British North America, and it wasn't about politics or exploring. It was a book of hymns for church. That one fact tells you pretty much everything you need to know about what was most important to the early colonists. Faith came first.
Now, outside the church, people were letting loose to the sounds of the fiddle, the flute, and the drum. And this is where a really crucial cultural mashup starts to happen. Enslaved Africans brought their own incredibly powerful musical traditions with them, these complex rhythms, call and response styles, and those sounds started to mix with European folk music, especially down in the South. This was the very, very beginning of a sound that would eventually become something uniquely American.
All right, we've covered the sights and the sounds. Now let's get into the printed word, which was this incredibly powerful force that shaped everything from religion and politics to just daily life.
But before you can print a single book, something else has to happen first, right? The year was 1638.
And the very first printing press was set up in the colonies, right in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I mean, this was a total game changer. For the first time, ideas could be copied and spread on a huge scale. It paved the way not just for religious books, but for all the newspapers and pamphlets that would, eventually fuel a revolution.
And wow, did print give sermons some serious firepower. Just listen to this famous line from the preacher Jonathan Edwards. "The God that holds you over the pit of hell abhors you." This wasn't just something people heard from a pulpit one Sunday. It was printed and passed around and read over and over. You can just feel the intense, fiery energy of that religious movement, the Great Awakening, in those words.
So colonial writing really had two main lanes.
In one lane, you've got this deeply religious stuff, sermons, personal diaries, and the spiritual poetry from writers like Anne Bradstreet. And then in the other lane, you have this growing mountain of practical and political work, everything from fiery revolutionary pamphlets to Benjamin Franklin's super clever and wildly popular Poor Richard's Almanac, which was just packed with witty, useful advice.
So what happens when you take all these threads, the art, the music, the literature, and you start weaving them together? Well, you get something completely new.
The big takeaway here is that this wasn't just imitation. Colonists were actively taking bits and pieces of European culture and remixing them to fit their new reality. And that process, that remixing of old traditions with new experiences, that was the creative act that laid the groundwork for what it means to be American.
So let's just break it down. What were the key ingredients in this new American culture? First, you have the adaptation of European styles. Second, you have the massive influence of religion and morality. Third, you've got this real focus on the creativity found in everyday life and functional things. And finally, and this is so important, you have the blending of all these different cultures, European, African, and indigenous, all mixing together into something brand new.
And that really leaves us with a final thought to chew on. This unique combination of deep religious faith, a sort of rugged practicality, and a long history of cultural blending, it was all baked into America's identity right from the very beginning. So the question is, where do you see the echoes of those colonial roots in American culture today?